addressed. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and speak in support of today's Opposition Day motion brought forward by the Honourable Member for Jonquière. The motion calls on this place to acknowledge that Canadians need better access to employment insurance benefits and calls on the government to take immediate action. This motion is very relevant to the people I represent in Essex. Over the past number of years and decades, southwestern Ontario has lost tens of thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing accounts for 11% of Canada's GDP and employs over 1.7 million Canadians, many of whom live in southwestern Ontario. But over the past decade, under the Conservatives' watch, 400,000 good-paying manufacturing jobs have been lost. Those job losses have impacted communities across my riding, including Amherstburg, Bell River, Essex, Harrow, Kingsville, Lakeshore, and LaSalle. According to Service Canada, the EI region of Windsor, which includes the riding I represent, has an unemployment rate of 9.6%. This is one of the highest unemployment rates in the country and much higher than the 7.2% national rate. In reality, we know that the rate is probably much higher than the 9.6% that Statistics Canada looks at. Statistics Canada has a narrow measure of unemployment that really only looks at those who are actively looking for work. In a region like the one I represent, which has experienced chronic underemployment over the years, people simply stop looking. Or they settle for lower-paying jobs or part-time work, sometimes piecing together 2 or 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet. They may also seek retraining opportunities, as I did in 2008, after being laid off from my auto manufacturing job. When I started working on the assembly line at Ford, we had 6,700 people. 20 years later, we are down to 1,500. People in my riding deserve fair and equitable access to employment insurance, because when you lose your job through no fault of your own, and there aren't many opportunities in the area you can turn to, you need time to make the important decisions about your future and the future of your family. Yesterday, I published an editorial in the Windsor Star which talks about Neil from London. Canadians were introduced to Neil during the Prime Minister's one-on-one interviews on CBC. Neil's interview embodied more than just a generation concerned about their financial retirement. He reminded me of all the people I've worked shoulder to shoulder with during my 19 years at Ford. It reminded me of the conversations I had at the doors of Essex voters. It reminded me why I'm now working in Ottawa as the MP for Essex. Thanks to Neil, the concerns he raised with the Prime Minister were brought to a national audience. His questions reflected the real anxiety that resides in manufacturing towns across southwestern Ontario. He became the face of tens of thousands of families. His questions were real and they were pointed. Sadly, they largely went unanswered by the Prime Minister. Canadians from all corners of our country face anxiety about mounting job losses. We know the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan are facing an extraordinary period of slow economic growth and falling energy prices. This has led to tens of thousands of workers losing their jobs, which means tens of thousands of families concerned about how they will make ends meet while trying to secure quality jobs in this economic downturn. When communities face mounting job losses, like Alberta over the past year or so, and southwestern Ontario over the past few decades, workers rely on fair access to the employment insurance benefits they've paid into for so many years. The Premier of Alberta, the Honourable Rachel Notley, knows EI is an important component of supporting families in these tough economic times. She said they're looking for a fast-paced adjustment to EI so they can expand eligibility for the length of claims, which are shorter in Alberta than in any other part of the country. While the Liberals talked a lot about improving access to EI during the election campaign, many Canadians will remember that it was a Liberal government that created many of the problems with EI that we are dealing with today. In fact, successive Liberal and Conservative governments have tightened eligibility criteria and pillaged $57 billion from the EI fund. They've distorted the purpose of the EI program, which is to provide income to workers who have the misfortune of losing their jobs. Looking back into the 1990s, the Liberal government of the day embarked on a devastating austerity program, reducing transfers to the provinces and cities and slashing services that Canadians rely on. Under the Liberals, employment insurance was radically overhauled to restrict eligibility requirements. In 1990, 8 out of 10 Canadians qualified for EI benefits, but after the Liberal government's changes, EI coverage fell to less than 50% of the unemployed. And let's talk about what the Liberal government did to the EI account. To provide a little background, when employers and workers pay into EI, the money goes into a consolidated specific purposes account. These specific purposes are very straightforward. EI premiums are intended to provide relief for workers who have lost their job. They're not meant for any other purpose, like funding reductions in the corporate tax rate or giving subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. EI premiums are meant for unemployed workers. What the Liberals did to the EI account is unconscionable. They raided the fund of about $50 billion. Rather than reducing premiums for small business owners and workers, the government took the money for their own purposes. Rather than increase access to EI for the unemployed, the government took the money for themselves. Rather than provide greater retraining opportunities for unemployed workers or address the serious skilled labour shortage that exists across Canada, the Liberal government took $50 billion out of the EI account and away from Canadian workers. So it's all well and good for the Liberals today to be talking about fixing some of the Conservatives' mess, but let's not forget the governing party's sordid history on this file. Fast forwarding to the 2000s, let's take a look at what the Conservatives did with EI. Faced with deepening recession in 2012, the Conservatives failed to address the economy and instead focused on attacking Canadian workers. They undertook a large series of reforms to EI that were designed to further restrict eligibility, especially for seasonal and lower wage workers. The number of people qualifying for EI hit an all-time low. Let's remember, in 1990, 8 of 10 Canadians qualified for EI benefits. After the Liberals were done with their changes, this number dropped to about 5 in 10. And after the Conservatives, just 4 out of 10 Canadians qualified for the benefits they had paid into. The Conservatives introduced new rules for forcing workers to accept lower wage jobs that pay up to 30% less than their previous job, or accept jobs that are up to an hour's drive from home. Refusing such jobs meant workers risk losing their benefits. The Conservatives also changed the rules for working while on claim pilot project, which penalized lower income earners, and they killed the extended EI benefits pilot program, which granted 5 extra weeks of benefits to workers in regions of high unemployment. Stealing a page from the Liberal playbook, the Conservative government diverted another $3 billion from the EI account to cover budget holes left by their multi-billion dollars in corporate tax giveaways. Hassan Youssef, president of the Canadian Labour Congress, put it well. How can you justify accumulating annual surpluses in the EI account when 63% of the unemployed do not receive the benefits? It's time the federal government stops raiding the EI account. Enough is enough. This money can never be recovered, and it's a grievous theft from Canadians who are at their most vulnerable. Today's motion proposes a clear way forward. First, it proposes to create a universal qualifying threshold of 360 hours, regardless of the regional rate of unemployment. Currently, the required hours range from 420 to 700 hours, which restricts EI eligibility for many Canadian workers. Leveling the playing field with a standard number of hours is good for workers, and it's a proposal that has been endorsed by 80 Canadian groups, including anti-poverty, women's groups, labour unions, and students' groups. Second, the motion proposes to repeal some of the Conservative government's harmful EI reforms. Forcing workers to accept low-paid jobs far from their homes puts an undue strain on families and prevents workers from securing the right job for their future. Let's get rid of these unnecessary measures and restore the pilot program to help seasonal workers. Third, the motion calls on Parliament to protect the EI account to ensure that funds are only spent on benefits for Canadians, including training, and never again used to boost the government's bottom line. This is such a critical part of this motion, and I would encourage my colleagues to acknowledge the wrongs of the past and support today's motion as a positive way forward that restores the EI program to its intended purpose. Thank you to my honourable colleague from Jonquière for bringing this motion before us today. On behalf of the people I represent in Essex, I will be voting yes to this motion.
Hear, hear. Thank you.